Prologue. Mouse changed trains at Baker Street, catching the tube just before the doors closed. That was a good omen. There was a seat available too, another good sign. She wedged herself between a tall, scruffy girl cradling a backpack on her lap and a middle-aged woman with an enormous black handbag. Mouse couldn't understand why other women burdened themselves in this way. She herself travelled light, with her essentials squirreled away in the pockets of her coat. It was important to be able to move around without clutter. The lad opposite her was a Prince William look-alike. He checked her out as she sat down, his eyes flicking over her without interest. She was used to that. She never raised much interest on first sight. But she could get a man's attention, all right, when she wanted to. Prince William turned back to his paper, raising it to shield his handsome face from her view, which was okay by her as she found herself staring at the best omen of all. There, on the raised page, was the smile that looked down on her at night and which welcomed her to each new day. The off-centre grin, firm jaw and blazing bright eyes, jade green when reproduced in colour like in the photo on her bedroom wall, of the man who held the key to her heart, just like she held the key to his. Not that he knew it yet, but it was only a matter of time. The train slowed as it approached Edgware Road, and Prince William got to his feet, tossing his paper onto his seat as he moved to the door. A man in a suit reached for it, but Mouse got there first, lunging across the carriage and snatching it almost out of the other's grasp. The man flashed her a dirty look, but before he could protest, Mouse said, "Thank you very much," with a tight little smile, which seemed to do the trick. He gave her a curt nod of the head, as if it had been his intention to pass the paper to her all along. She knew his type. The teacher, doctor, magistrate sort, professional big shots, keen on the appearance of things, like being polite, while underneath they despised people like her. But she knew how to get even with his kind, pay a visit to his wife with a carving knife in her hand. He wouldn't be so full of himself after that. Everyone around was looking at her, making her squirm inside, and it wouldn't have been so long ago that such scrutiny would have brought on one of her panic attacks. But things were different now. She could ignore all the nosy Parkers around her because what they thought was not her problem. Mr. Carter had taught her that, even if he had turned out to be such a two-faced bastard. Not that he mattered one bit to her these days. She had someone much better. Her fingers shaking with excitement, she quickly turned the paper over to the page she had seen across the aisle. There were two photographs side by side under the banner "Head to Head Hots Up," but Mouse only had eyes for the one on the left. It was a disgrace horse racing didn't have more space in the newspapers. If Josh were a footballer, his lovely face would be on the back page every day, blown up big, just like it was on her wall. As it was, she had to make do with pictures like this, sharing coverage with the other rider, the one who was leading in the race for champion jockey. That's what the article was all about. She read the words, but they told her nothing new. Her eyes caressed Josh's image. He was wearing a riding helmet, which was a pity, because she liked him best bareheaded, with his fair hair flopping over his forehead. The truth was, she thought as she smiled mischievously to herself, she'd really like him best, bare all over, his lean, sinewy body hard against hers, his strong arms crushing her. Ooh, yes. It made her positively light-headed. The train slowed and she looked up. The man in a suit was still staring at her, as if he knew just what she was thinking and didn't approve. Maybe she had been giggling out loud. Well, too bad. This was her stop. She stood up abruptly and thrust the newspaper at Mr. Suit. "You can have it now," she said boldly, her Midlands accent cutting through the snotty London silence. She didn't want it anyway. There was a coffee stain right across the page. She'd buy another copy later, a clean one. Mouse emerged onto the streets of grey, wintry London. On holiday trips as a kid, she'd never liked the big city. The traffic, the tall buildings, the way people looked through you as if you weren't there. Of course, in those days, she didn't feel as if she was anywhere, and didn't want to be anywhere either. Certainly not being herded around Madame Tussauds or the Science Museum by her sort of stepfather, Mum's partner Dennis, and tagging on to a group of kids who treated her like dirt. But now she was beginning to feel like she could handle the big smoke. The people didn't freak her out anymore, even though they were just as creepy as they'd always been, like the man on the tube trying to take her paper. But she had not let him get away with it. These days, she knew how to stand up for herself. If she were still having sessions, Mr. Carter, Gavin, would have claimed the credit for her becoming more assertive. He wouldn't have said so exactly, but he'd have implied it. "See how much better you feel once you express your feelings," he'd say, running a hand through his thick mop of black hair. "I think we're making genuine progress." Of course, he hadn't wanted her to express her real feelings. Not around him, at any rate, outside the hours of 3 to 4 on a Thursday afternoon. He might have sounded excited and enthusiastic about her progress, but that was just jargon, wasn't it? The kind of phony baloney they teach at psychiatrist's school. And Mr. Gavin Carter was the biggest phony of them all. But she was done with him. There was a new man in her life, and she wasn't going to screw it up like last time. All those letters and phone calls had been a mistake. "Take it slowly," she said to herself, as she reached into her inside pocket to check that the keys were still in place. She'd be lost without them. They made everything possible. When she had first started helping out on reception at her cousin's garage, she had been amazed at how carefree people were with their keys. They'd hand over a whole bunch just because they were too lazy to take off the car key, or maybe too trusting. That's how it was with Josh. He must have thought that she was honest when he'd pressed them into her hand. How sweet. It made her love him all the more. She waited impatiently by the zebra crossing, looking across the road at her destination, a 5-story apartment building of weathered terracotta and cream brick. How many flats did it hold? She didn't know, but in her pocket was the key to number 48, and that was in the middle of the block. There were 3 separate entrances at the front and spaces for cars, most of them new or else well-maintained fancy models like Bentleys or BMWs. Nothing like the crap motors parked in the narrow streets where she lived. This was a northwest London mansion block, and the people who lived here didn't know how well off they were. At last the cars came to a halt and allowed her to cross. It was a wide road, 6 lanes of traffic, full of motorists heading in and out of town. She could sense their impatience as she sauntered across. She wasn't going to hurry for these southern bastards. Let them wait. She followed the pavement off the main thoroughfare into the access road that led to the front of the building and walked up the steps to the middle door. The dark wood and brass furnishings gleamed as if they had just been polished, which, she supposed, they had been. Though she had never come across a cleaner or a caretaker, from the pristine state of the building she knew they must be regularly at work. Her heart was pumping as she put the downstairs key into the lock. Once, on her second visit, when she was still all of a quiver at the thought of being caught, she had found the door propped open. When she had reached the first landing, she'd come face to face with an old lady carrying Marks and Spencer bags into her flat. "I've left the downstairs door open," she announced in plummy tones. "Be a good girl and shut it for me, will you? You've got younger legs." Mouse had nearly run off there and then, but she'd realised that would look odd, so she'd shut the door as instructed and simply accepted the elderly resident's thanks as she passed her on the way upstairs. She had worked out then what she would say if she were asked to identify herself. "I'm Mr. Swallow, sister. He's asked me to pop in and water the plants." But no one had challenged her yet. The staircase was laid with plush maroon carpet, and the banisters were of dark mahogany, the same shade as the downstairs door. The heat was high as ever, in contrast to the winter chill of the street. Mouse loved it in here. The posts of the stairwell were decorated with carved leaf shapes, and topped with big, glossy wooden balls the size of grapefruits that fitted snugly into the palm of your hand. It was like being in a hotel, a real ritzy one. She liked the idea of being rich. The woman who married Josh would be rich. It would be better even than being the wife of a psychiatrist. All the papers said Josh was going to retire soon, so they'd be able to travel the world together, staying at the swankiest places. He'd probably want to attend posh racing events. She wouldn't mind that, provided she got to do stuff she wanted. She could go on shopping sprees in places like Milan and Paris and New York. Get herself some smart clothes. There was a limit to the charm of man-made fabric. Of course, they couldn't go swanning around all the time. Josh would have to find a new direction in life, apart from her, of course. She'd help him. She'd chuck in the rubbish job and be Josh's manager. Get him on the telly with those other ex-jockeys all banging on about horses. He'd be a sensation on the box, with those sparkling eyes and that grin that sent shivers down your spine. Women would fancy the pants off him, which would be too bad for them because Josh would be all hers. God help any slutty bitch who gave her man the come-on. She knew how to defend her territory. Mouse was on the 4th floor landing now, with Josh's door on the right. She stood, as she always did. It was a sort of ritual, quite still, facing the polished surface of his door, gathering herself. Her heart was pounding with excitement, and the urge to rush inside was almost irresistible. But she resisted. She had to. She made herself follow the strategy she had devised, just to be safe. First she put on her gloves, the thin semi-transparent surgical sort. It was a bit of a nuisance keeping them on all the time, but she was proud of her newfound attention to detail. After what had happened to B.J., before Josh, she wasn't taking any chances. Next she placed her eye to the small brassy spy hole in the centre of the door. Not that you could see much inside, but it was possible to tell if a light was on in the hallway beyond. There was no light. As she stood there, she listened intently for a radio, a television, anything that would indicate the flat was occupied. Though she knew Josh was riding at Huntingdon that afternoon, someone else might possibly be there, a cleaner, or a friend, or, and this was the most likely, the mistake, the blonde waste of space who was currently clinging to Josh's coat-tails. Mouse pressed the bell. It was the last act in her list of precautions. If anyone was inside, that should flush them out. And if the door opened, she'd ask for Mrs. Watson, who she'd discovered from studying the name tags at the next entrance along, lived at number 38. "Oh, this is 48, she'd say. She had it all prepared. "My mistake, so sorry." She hoped that wouldn't happen. not least because if the door opened to reveal the mistake standing there in